Welcome, everyone, to this week's webinar. We are super happy to have everyone joining us today. I am Loretta Maddox. I'm an account executive and compliance specialist here at Healthcare Compliance Pros. Today, I have with me Chad Schiffman, our Director of Compliance, and I have Nicole Mark, our Marketing Manager, and she will be helping us with our poll questions and then moderating any questions that you may have. So we are going to not talk about COVID-19 as the main topic during this webinar. We are going to focus on contingency planning. And so what we want to do is, we thought it would be appropriate, and I know I said we're not going to talk about COVID-19, but based on what has happened, we have realized that there really is a need for understanding the contingency planning portion of the security rule, which does include disaster recovery plan and emergency mode operations, along with some other things. So we did want to focus on that today. So Chad and I are going to be basically talking with you about the things that you need to have in place in the event something does happen that causes a loss of data or access to data, so that hopefully you can be back up and running soon, and in addition to that, also comply with the security rule. So with that being said, I just want to spend a moment talking about the security rule and what you are required to do. As a part of being either a covered entity or a business associate under the security rule, you have an obligation to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of all electronic protected health information that is created, received, maintained, or transmitted. And I think it's important to look beyond just an electronic health record or just a billing system. We've got to look at everywhere that you have electronic protected health information created, received, maintained, or transmitted. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through today's webinar. You are also required to do a risk analysis of all of the electronic protected health information that you have. And by doing this, you also need to establish safeguards, and that is broken down into administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. So these are the safeguards that are in the security rule. And I wanted to spend just a second and go over what each section really means. The administrative safeguards within the security rule are basically your policies and procedures. This is what you're doing from a policy and procedure standpoint to make sure that you have the appropriate safeguards in place. This also includes your staff training and anything else that you have to carry out these security requirements. Physical safeguards are going to be actually limiting the physical access to anywhere where your electronic protected health information is stored. And then on the technical safeguard side, this is where you are making sure that only the appropriate people are able to access information, that you're transmitting information in a secure way, and that only authorized individuals can access via their computer or other electronic device, that we're making sure we're keeping that locked down so that unauthorized access cannot occur or is less likely to occur. So as another part of the security rule, within the administrative, physical, and technical safeguards, there are standards and there are implementation specifications. And this is where it gets really a little bit muddy for people when they're trying to comply with the security rule, because we get questions, what do these mean? Do I have to implement all of these things? So I really wanted you to understand the difference between a standard and an implementation specification. A standard is going to be the process that is required by the security rule to be implemented to protect that EPHI. The implementation specifications are additional detailed instructions for how to implement that particular standard. And so today we're going to talk about the contingency planning standard and the implementation specifications that help you comply with that standard. But before we get into that, I want to give Chad an opportunity, if you could just go over the difference between required and addressable implementation specifications.
Sure, absolutely. So required, as it states, that's something that must be implemented. The standard implementation specification is a requirement, basically to comply with the HIPAA security rule. They're generally pretty straightforward for most organizations. Really, a lot of good information that helps you, figure out what needs to be implemented. Whereas addressable, the way to look at an addressable standard is, even though it's addressable and you can come up with a different way to address it, it doesn't mean that you skip it completely. It means that you must assess whether the standard or implementation specification is reasonable. For example, one that we like to talk about frequently is encryption. Encryption is technically an addressable. It's addressable, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can't just bypass it altogether. If you're going to implement something different, you better have a reasonable and appropriate safeguard that's at least equal to encryption. And whatever you determine on that, you must have that totally documented so that you're protected in the event of an audit to say, if you had a breach or whatever and some PHI went missing, it would be good. And they said, well, is your systems encrypted? And you said, no, but here's the safeguard we have in place. You should have that documented.
And wouldn't you say, Chad, that the reason that there are so many addressable implementation specifications is because the rule was written so long ago, and also because I believe the intent was to make this where it's scalable for different organizations. But the thing is, now we are well past the point where the rule was written, and a lot of the things that were addressable that weren't maybe feasible for practices years ago, now it's really hard to, it would really be difficult to say, well, we can't do that, or it's too expensive. Now, some of these things might be, but wouldn't you kind of agree with that, Chad?
Oh, absolutely. And there might be different processes that say a small organization would have in place that are obviously different than a large organization with more robust systems that would be in place. So I think that's part of it as well with making it addressable. There's definitely more than one way to skin a cat quite frequently, but when it comes to addressing some of these standards, you got to make sure that you have something that is at least similar to what the rule is requiring.
Exactly. And as I'm sure all of you had heard at some point in time, addressable does not mean optional. I think we've heard folks from the OCR say that on a multitude of occasions.
Absolutely.
So,
I think of a presentation that I've heard them talk about, whether it's encryption or any other addressable standards where they haven't mentioned that.
Right. So I think at this point, we're going to go ahead and get into what our main topic is today, contingency planning. And this is, it's a requirement of the security rule. And Chad, I'm going to give you a second to just go over this part of the presentation.
Sure. Yeah. So contingency planning, basically what this is saying is healthcare organizations must have contingency plans that establish policies and procedures for responding to an emergency or other occurrence. For example, fire, system failure, or natural disaster. Any of these systems that could damage EPHI. So that's really the purpose of the contingency plan. This is the standard, as we've talked about. The contingency plan has 4 implementation specifications, but before we move on to those, anything you want to add on contingency planning, Loretta?
Well, I think there are 5. I think we have 5 implementation specifications, unless I miscounted. So, but no, I think just the point to remember is it's anything that could threaten the security of EPHI. And not just things that are listed on the screen, but, there are a number of things that could happen. So I think that's why it's just so important at this point to talk about it.
Yeah, I was just going to schedule downtime, short-term system outages, anything like that, long-term outages, even end of life, you want to have contingency planning in place for, end of life of systems.
Right. The other thing too that, I know we've got system failure up here, but how about just internet access? I think that has been it's become an essential service now. And I know I have been down from having internet access. There was a fiber cable cut, and I can't work. I can't have access to data. And so those are things to think about too. It may not be a natural disaster. It may be the fact that they're doing construction and now all of a sudden you don't have access. So how are you going to get to that data?
We see that a lot with this whole COVID-19 outbreak. A lot of clients would reach out to us and say, hey, we've got this remote workforce. They're used to being sitting at a desk. How are we going to get access to these systems? And they had to look at the contingency plans to see what they had in place there. So it's a real interesting time for us this year where we actually got to test a lot of this stuff that may not have otherwise been tested from some healthcare organizations.
Exactly. So with that, and we're going to jump into the implementation specifications, but before we do that, we do have our first poll question. And I know Chad and I have worked with practices who have had data losses, but I'm curious to know if those of you on the webinar today, has your organization experienced a data loss due to either an inadequate or corrupt backup? So I'd love for you guys to participate, if you don't mind, and just let us know if you've experienced any of this in your practice
it's interesting.
Or in your business.
It wasn't too long ago that we had a practice who had exactly that happen. It was kind of a tough experience for them.
Right. Well, it looks like most of you, 82% of you on today's webinar have not. That is a very good thing. For 9% of you that have, I feel your pain. I know that is very difficult to go through, but I think those 9% probably understand how important it is to have an adequate backup. So let's go ahead and talk about that, the data backup plan. So this implementation specification is required. As Chad was talking about earlier, there are some that are addressable and some that are required. This one is absolutely required. And it basically, the implementation specification is that you must establish and implement procedures to create and maintain retrievable exact copies of EPHI. So as we talk about a data backup plan, there are things to consider. And Chad, do you want to talk about those just a little bit?
Yeah, so, you obviously, as you kind of talked about here, you must be capable of backing up your data regularly while having a reliable, and tested method for recovering data and applications. And we'll talk a little bit more about testing here in just a little bit, but a lot of that includes, making sure that you have full network visibility, your physical and technical safeguards and HIPAA compliance are considerations that is part of that in making sure that your patient data is always accessible and secure. So this can be systems contained within your practice management and accounting systems, your EHR, diagnostic imaging, that's a big one, electronic test results, and even other documents that we see that need to be considered as part of your data backup plan.
Right. And I think sometimes we forget to look, and this is why it's important to have a very good inventory of where all of your electronic protected health information is. And that really does require more than just one or two people being involved in that. You really need to talk to your workforce and figure out, okay, are you guys saving stuff in a Word document that has to do with the patient? Have you written letters that are outside the EHR? That is all EPHI that has to be backed up and has to be maintained and has to be kept secure. So it's very important to understand where all of your information is so it can be backed up appropriately.
Yeah. Another thought on inventories is we've seen more focus from OCR than ever before on inventories. In fact, as part of security risk analysis, they've really been critical on making sure that organizations have that solid backup, have it identified, know where your EPHI is. That's really almost the first step nowadays.
Right. And it's beyond just your hardware. When you think inventory, I think a lot of times you think about, oh, well, it's just the PCs or the laptops that I have, but it's really any applications you have as well that store that data. So moving on to our next implementation specification, this is also required. It is required that you establish and then, of course, implement as needed procedures to restore any loss of data. So this is that disaster recovery plan that you've heard us talk about quite a bit. So in the event there was a system failure, this is where you would have to have procedures in place that, okay, how are we going to bring this data back up? How are we going to get access to that quickly? And so things to consider here are, what needs to be restored? What data needs to be restored? Are we just focusing on, our EHR first, or is there other data? And again, that kind of takes us back to that inventory, wouldn't you say, Chad, as far as trying to understand what information we really need to get restored?
Yeah, definitely. And, a good example that I would like to mention on this is it's hurricane season where I'm at, and here,
right.
These healthcare organizations, most healthcare organizations here have a pretty robust disaster recovery plan, emergency response plan, which will be the next one that we talk about, and making sure that they have those procedures in place when the tornadoes or hurricanes or different things come through, or even in the case of a pandemic, there could have been situations that impacted data. And so all that information should be considered as part of that disaster recovery plan. As this mentions, does it address issues specific to the organization's operating environment? That's a key consideration. Or what data needs to be restored, and that once again goes back to your inventory, as you've mentioned, and that plan needs to be accessible, and those who are really involved with the disaster recovery plan activities need to understand what their roles and responsibilities are. Those are critical pieces to your disaster recovery plan.
And I've talked to a few clients recently that have, they've developed their disaster recovery plan, but they just have it stored, electronically. Well, if everything's down electronically, you may not be able to get access to it. So I think, as Chad mentioned, you need to make sure everyone on that disaster recovery team knows their responsibilities, but also has a hard copy that's off-site, because otherwise you can't get to the plan. So you want to make sure that you do have access to that in multiple locations.
And I think it's important with it too to think of it, it's a plan. It's just not like one of those check boxes to say that you've actually done it to comply with the security rule. Similar to an SRA, it's not, it's got to be an ongoing process and with updates and revisions to make sure that plan is truly useful to you in the event of that disaster.
Well, and two, with a disaster recovery plan, it's not, I mean, as Chad mentioned, it's hurricane season, so you have to have a plan just for safety of your staff and patients and those things. But this is different. This is specific to your data. So don't be confused by having a disaster plan and thinking you're good, because you still need to address the data. So, Chad, do you want to talk a little bit about emergency mode operations?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is another required implementation specification. Healthcare organizations must establish and implement as needed procedures to enable continuation of critical business processes. So this is something that we saw with COVID-19. What was the process, the emergency mode operation plan that they needed to have to make sure that they could continue operations, or at least getting access to the information, especially when quarantined? That was a big deal that we ran into. And what if there was a technical failure that happened during COVID-19? How would you address that? All those were considerations, with your emergency mode operations plan. But that's not just true for COVID-19, it's any emergency situation, as we've been talking about some of these other examples, fires, earthquakes, hurricanes, whatever the case may be. Any sort of emergency system that requires you to operate in that emergency mode is what this plan considers.
Right.
So, do you have that plan to protect your data with the need to access the data. That's important. Or alternative security measures be used to protect EPHI in the event of an emergency. These type of considerations are critical to have as part of your emergency mode operations plan.
And I think the one thing that does get confusing is, I think a lot of times there's this idea, especially with so many of you having your data in the cloud, that you think, well, the emergency mode operations is that we just access it from a different location. And that may very well be the case. The thing is, with this first question to consider, does the organization's plan balance the need to protect data with the need to access data? Well, you may have a policy that your staff is never to access EPHI over a public Wi-Fi network, but in an emergency situation, there may not be a choice. So how are we going to balance the need to access that data versus the need to access it in a way that may be less protected than it was, you know, in normal operations? So it's you really have to think through not only how you're getting access to that, well, or where your data is. Yes, it may be in the cloud, but how are we going to access it and in an emergency situation? And how are we still going to do what we can to protect it in an environment that may be different than what you're used to?
Yeah, down here in down in South Florida, I'm actually in the Panhandle, but down in South Florida last year when the big hurricane happened, you know, there was an issue to where healthcare organizations were scrambling to access their backups. And so a lot of them, you know, had the cloud storage options for EPHI, and some within the healthcare organization itself had the backups. Their emergency mode operations plans for them, what was really critical is to make sure that it gave them clear instructions on how to access that EPHI, because some of their systems were actually damaged. So by them having that emergency mode operations plan and understanding that, hey, we can go to this remote location, use a different system to access our data, we're not going to lose anything because of those backups. All that was all tied into this whole contingency planning process that we're talking about today.
Right. So now we're going to move on to the last two implementation specifications, and these are both addressable, but as Chad was talking about earlier, addressable doesn't mean you get to bypass this. So if you're not going to implement this procedure, you have to have a reason why, and it has to be, and then you also have to have a reasonable safeguard in place that is equally as good. So, and as far as testing and revision procedures, this applies to all of the other implementation specifications that we've discussed under the contingency plan. So that means you should be testing your backups to see if your backup is actually adequate. For those 9% of you that said that you have experienced a data loss based on an inadequate or a corrupt backup, you realize the importance of why you should be testing those backups. And I have heard from a number of different healthcare providers and organizations over my years of doing this that sometimes that's difficult, sometimes it's costly. And yes, those things can be true, but there are ways, and I would encourage you to talk to whoever manages your IT to find some way to be able to test your backups. If it's something that is not feasible for you financially, we've got to find some kind of alternative. And it may be something as simple as checking the file size. If your backup is, you know, a certain amount one day, but the next day it is half that, then there's probably a problem there. And that could trigger a deeper investigation to determine, okay, what is happening? Because there's nothing worse than thinking your backup is good and having your system fail and realizing it was not. And there's not much you can do at that point.
A lot of IT guys that I've been talking to lately talk about, we don't necessarily test that frequently, but what we do is verify that we have a program in place or a process to make sure that the files are at least reviewed and verified to make sure the data is, authenticated, and we can use that information in the event of an emergency. And all those steps are what they have documented as part of their emergency mode plan. And then also their testing and revision procedures are well spelled out, saying that this is what we will do in the event of that emergency or disaster. And that the systems have been verified, their backups are verified, they're reviewed, they're made sure that the files aren't corrupt and those types of things. And that's the way they're able to get around having to do costly testing. And so far, knock on wood, they've been successful. They haven't had any issues, but those are just some ideas that you can look at, especially as a smaller organization that might not be able to do a true test. And some of your cloud providers who store your data, some of them will guarantee the backups that you will have, in fact, that authenticated data or whatever that won't be compromised.
And if they're doing the testing, that's a great point, Chad. If your cloud providers are doing testing, then document that as a part of your contingency plan. So our last implementation specification is application and data criticality. So this is basically saying what information, what applications and information systems need, what order do they need to be uploaded in? What do we need access to the most? And I think this is an area that also gets skipped quite a bit because it's just not thought of. But, and again, it's addressable, but still, if you were to have a complete system failure or a natural disaster, a hurricane, a tornado, something that just wipes everything out, do you have a plan that's going to say, okay, these are the systems, these are the PCs we need to buy, these are the laptops we need to buy, this is the the memory that we need to have on them, this is the order in which our software needs to be uploaded and data needs to be restored. Because you don't want to have to worry about that in the midst of that emergency. And I think that's why this one is so important.
Oh, I would agree. And what I'd add too is it all goes back to your inventory, and you can almost use your application and data criticality analysis while doing your inventory. You can document in order the importance of your information systems and include that on your inventory, and then take that information and help you flush out this policy, make sure that you have it addressed to where you can say, in our inventory, we have laptops, desktops, servers, or whatever at a location, and we've determined that these are high priority, critical for our operations. But in the event that anything happens to that, the way we are able to address that is with our backup plan, because we have a laptop that we could use remotely to access our information systems. And those types of considerations that you can all link to your inventory and tie it right back to your applications and data criticality analysis. I would actually encourage you to make sure that information is spelled out in your notes section on your inventory sheets.
That's an excellent recommendation. So with all of this that we've covered today, we wanted to get an idea of how you feel about your contingency plan. So our last poll question is, do you have a contingency plan in place that addresses all of the implementation specifications that we've outlined in today's webinar? And so far, and this is really kind of, it is interesting to see.
I'm wondering,
and it's okay if you're unsure. Oh, I'm sorry, Chad, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's going to be interesting to see if it's a similar percentage to the last one. Oh, I'm not sure. Okay.
And you know what? That's okay. That if you're not sure, but we had 0 no's, so that's good. That's good. But those of you who, well, first of all, 38% of you said yes. I'm very impressed with that. That's fantastic. If you've got a contingency plan that outlines all of these things, then that's great. The 63% of you that are unsure, I think this is a great opportunity to dust off the contingency plan that you have, try to find it if you don't know where it is, and take a look at it as compared to the information that we've outlined today. And also know that these are things that we can assist you with. I mean, so definitely reach out to us if you have questions. Chad, do you want to add anything else to the contingency plan?
Oh, I would agree totally with everything you just said there. I would just, when you're performing your security risk analysis, that's a really good opportunity to look at your contingency plan as well. Make sure that you have what you need in place, and if you don't, just feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to help with that part of it. I'm actually really anxious to get onto this next part of our presentation that you want to talk about.
So we do have one update that we thought you would be very interested in hearing. The Section 1557 the final rule was issued on Friday, and there is so much information in this that we are going to make this the topic of our June 30 webinar, because Chad and I have talked about it, and there's a major change that is included in the final rule, but we also feel like this is an area that maybe not 100% of you are realizing what you have to do to be compliant with the initial rule. So just as a brief reminder, Section 1557 was included in the ACA, and it prohibits discrimination in healthcare programs or activities, and it's based on these 4 civil rights statutes, but it's never been applicable in the healthcare setting before Section 1557. So there are certain requirements for postings. There were certain requirements for, some of you may remember the mandate for taglines in significant communications. This is where you would have to list in at least the top 15 or more languages that could be available in your area. You were having to stick these taglines in every significant communication. That could be a statement that was mailed out, that these had to be posted throughout in the practice. So that mandate for the taglines in significant communications has been removed. So that's a big deal, because that was a very costly part of Section 1557. So we're going to spend more time talking about this on June 30th webinar. But Chad, did you have anything else you wanted to mention at this point?
No, I think it's going to be a great webinar, and the fact that we've ran into so many questions about Section 1557, and understandably so. Whether I'm on site or doing a site visit or security risk analysis, for example, or even remotely, we've been getting a lot of questions about, well, what do I really need to have posted, or what do I need to provide our patients, and that kind of thing. So I think it's a good thing to revisit, even if clients are aware of some of these requirements, but it will also be a good opportunity for us to really focus on some of these major changes, some of which we're real excited about, like removing the the mandate for the non-discriminatory notices and taglines. I know my shred it bin will be happy not to have to shred those all the time when I receive them from my EOB, because I get them all the time from
exactly
insurance company. So that'll be nice. And I don't know how many practices we're actually sending them out. I know there was a lot of confusion with that. So this will be a really good webinar to clear up all of that information.
Right. And just a good refresher on what is required.
Absolutely.
So at this point, do we have any questions about anything that we've covered today? Just as a reminder, you can send those questions either through the questions tab or in the chat box. Nicole, has anybody had any questions at this point?
Nothing come in so far. We just have had a few people asking for the slides. So as a reminder, we will post those on the website this afternoon. And Loretta, if you want to share that link with them, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I actually have the link to the to next week's webinar.
Perfect.
So, and just as a quick reminder, I know I said I didn't want to talk a whole lot about COVID-19, but we do still have the toolkit, and we do still get quite a few questions regarding on just how to deal with employees that are coming back to work, employees that are experiencing symptoms, and what do we do with that? And so there are a lot of questions still related as we are going back to work. So don't forget that you have access to the toolkit for sure. And then, of course, if you have questions, please continue to send those to us, because we definitely want to continue to help get those answered for you. And then as far as moving forward, our next webinar 2 weeks from today, June 30th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, we're going to be talking about Section 1557, understanding it, complying with it, understanding the final rule and how it made changes. And this is the link to register to that. So unless there are any more questions, Nicole, has anything else popped in?
Nope, nothing else.
Okay. Chad, do you have any final words you would like to add?
Oh, looking forward to this next webinar. Looking forward to talk about Section 1557. We'll might have some bonus content as well. We're thinking about adding some information, perhaps to clear up some understandings about notice of privacy practices, for example, and where that should be posted and how it should be provided to patients. So we might include a little bit of information on that as well as part of this webinar as a bonus.
Great. So thank you to all of you who attended today. I'm hoping you found it helpful. If you have any questions that you think of later, please feel free to reach out to us. But otherwise, we will see you on the 30th. Take care.
Have a great day, everyone.